So we learned yesterday about the Har HaBayis. The Har HaBayis is what we call the Machne Levia, meaning the Har HaBayis that's corresponding to the camp of the Levium that camped around the Beis HaMikdash, that camped around the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, you had Machne Shechina, that was the Oyel Moed itself, the place of the Mishkan, which had the inner courtyard and the outer courtyard. You had the Machne Levia, which is where the Levium were around. And then you had the Machne Yisrael, which that's Yerushalayim. Now we learned about how in the future, Har HaBayis will be 6 times the size as Har HaBayis was in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. Which that shows on the idea of actually taking the world and transforming it also into a Beis HaMikdash. Which is what we said, that all the shuls are going to be on the Har HaBayis. The world that today we use as a place, a shul where we daven to Hashem, then it's going to be not just a shul, but it's going to be actual part of the Beis HaMikdash. This is the idea of the Har HaBayis. Now let's go to the Ezras Nashim. What is the Ezras Nashim? What was it? The Ezras Nashim, usually when we speak about it, we picture the Weiber Shul, the women's gallery that you have in a shul. That's what we call the Ezras Nashim. The truth is, the Ezras Nashim in the Beis HaMikdash is not exactly that. Let's first start with what the Ezras Nashim was, and then we can perhaps go to understand why it's called the Ezras Nashim. The actual Beis HaMikdash is based on the Mishkan, and therefore, when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, in fact, in Melachim, where it discusses the Beis HaMikdash, it only talks about this. This is the Beis HaMikdash. This is called the Beis HaMikdash, this is called the Azara, and this is called the Heichal, exactly like it was in the Mishkan in Oyel Moed, like we learned about, that it had the inner and outer courtyards. So that was the Ezras Nashim, that was the Azara, and that's the Heichal. The Heichal is like the Oyel Moed with the addition of the Ulam, and this is like the Chatzar Oyel Moed, the courtyard of Oyel Moed, where they brought the Korbanos. Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the Beis HaMikdash, he did it al pi Hashem, he did it with the blueprint that was given to him by his father, David HaMelech. And according to that blueprint, he added another courtyard. Now it's interesting because that courtyard is not even described. Why is it not described? Because it's not essentially really part of the Beis HaMikdash. How do we know that Shlomo HaMelech added it? We do find, the first time that we find a reference to it is in the time of King Yehoshaphat. King Yehoshaphat was, give or take, about 150, 200 years after Shlomo HaMelech. He was a great-great-grandson of Shlomo HaMelech. So that's about midway of the first Beis HaMikdash era. And there, the Pasuk in Divrei Hayamim describes that Yehoshaphat stood right outside of the Chatzer HaChadasha, the new courtyard of the Beis Hashem, of the Beis HaMikdash. The meaning of the new courtyard, the Gemara explains that they made new halachas in it. And we're talking about the Ezras Nashim. Now, even the simple meaning, the Pshat, the Radak and the Metzudas who explain it according to Pshat, they don't say that it was just made then. Rather, they say that it was perhaps refurbished. But everyone agrees that the Ezras Nashim existed beforehand. This is perhaps the first place it's mentioned. It seems from Tana Devilio that even in Mishkan Shiloh they had an Ezras Nashim. What does it mean they made new rules in it? The Ezras Nashim, by definition, is part of Har HaBayis. The only 3 differences that there are in the actual Beis HaMikdash that exists according to the Torah is there's the actual Beis HaMikdash. It's actually more than that. But there's the actual Beis HaMikdash, which is like the Mishkan. There's the different holiness between the Azara and the Heichal, and in the Heichal between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. Then there's Machane Levia, which also has its own set of rules, which that's the Harabayas. And then there's Machane Yisrael, which is Yerushalayim. There's no place in the Torah rules for a concept called Ezras Nashim. And therefore, when Shlomo HaMelech built it, it was another courtyard inside Harabayis itself. Later, they made different rules and they made two new things, midrabanan. One is inside the Chel. The Chel is the area around the Beis HaMikdash, inside the Seirig. The Seirig was a picket fence, 10 tfachim high, 10 handbreadths high. It would be about 80 centimeters high. And it was in order to tell people, stop here, don't go any further. If you're not Jewish or if you're not tar, you're not pure, then you're not allowed to go anywhere past here. Certain tumas weren't allowed in the Harabayis either, but for example, even someone who touched a dead body was allowed in Harabayis. A zav, etc., wasn't allowed in Harabayis. Keri wasn't allowed in Harabayis, etc. But certain impurities are only from the Chel onwards. Now, even though it's not really the Beis HaMikdash, it's an extra fence that the sages added. Ezras Nashim, they added an added level, but it's still not the Beis HaMikdash. For example, in the Beis HaMikdash, inside the Azara, you're not allowed to sit. In the Ezras Nashim, you're allowed to. What's the purpose of this Ezras Nashim? It's a courtyard 135 ames by 135 ames, a large square. Once you make a Beis HaMikdash, which is an established place, a place where people come to daven to Hashem, that means that people won't only come here in order to bring karbanis. These are the 11 ames for a person who's standing watching his karban being brought. People will come to daven. People will come to connect to the spiritual aura of the place, etc. They don't need to go into this place. This place is probably only people who are bringing karbanis. Someone who just comes to daven, first of all, he should be able to sit. Second of all, certain people who aren't allowed in the Azara should be allowed there. And that's why they made this area called the Ezras Nashim. In other words, it's an added place which is added on, extra, added onto the Beis HaMikdash, taking something which isn't really part of the Beis HaMikdash and sort of making it into the Beis HaMikdash. Why is it called the Ezras Nashim? There's two options. One option is because they made a balcony around the walls of this courtyard for the women. Some say that this balcony was only made on by Simchas Beis HaSheva because then everyone wanted to see. Others, and from the Rambam, it seems to imply that once they made it because of Simchas Beis HaSheva, because then a lot of women would come to see. And other times, I guess there was possible you could just stand separately. There wasn't the need so much, but here there was a whole celebration going on. They didn't want the men and women to be mixed, so they put a separation. According to the Rambam, actually, what they built was on the east side. Over here, there was no wall originally. They built sort of bleachers. They built sort of bleachers so that the women could stand and watch what was going on. I imagine the women had an even better, they had a better view than the men because the men were standing on the same level. The women wanted to see what's going on in the courtyard with the dancing, etc. They were able to have a much better view. But according to the Rambam, they left it there the entire year, meaning that now women had a place where they can stand to see, not necessarily meaning women didn't come into the courtyard itself. So that's one option of why it's called Ezras Nashim, because of the special thing that they added there where the women stood, so they gave the entire courtyard the name Ezras Nashim. Another option is that usually women didn't stand in the Azara. Not that they weren't allowed to, but generally speaking, men went there to do smicha, etc. It's a very small area. It's not necessarily small in its width, but in its length, it's only 11 amas. So generally, women didn't stand there. When they needed to, when they brought a karban, there was this gate which was known as the Shara Nashim, the women's gate, where they would stand here to watch their karban being brought. So generally, although men also came in this courtyard, but women generally were in this courtyard, so that gave it the name Ezras Nashim. Perhaps there's an added thing, and that's the concept that in the Beis Hamikdash, everything has its place. Whether it means you're not allowed to be or you're allowed to be, or everyone has their place in their mission, everyone has their designated place. That's part of a Beis Hamikdash. It's a set thing where everyone has where they're designated, where they can better fulfill their mission. The mission of women is to bring light into the world. And thus, in the Ezras Nashim, which isn't officially part of the Beis Hamikdash, they're bringing the light into it. The mission of men is more to deal with the karbanis, to fight with the world, to fight with the distractions in the world. It says, "Ish darkei lichbeish," a man has to conquer the physical world. That's the idea of bringing karbanis and elevating them. And that's why this is the Ezras Nashim, showing also not just to the women's gallery, but rather to the women's mission. The women's mission, everyone has their place and everyone has their mission and their way of how they can fulfill it. Now, an interesting point, which we're going a little, okay, we have some time still. An interesting point is that in the third Beis Hamikdash, one of the things which will be very different is the Ezras Nashim. In fact, one of the major differences, the Heichal is almost exactly the same. According to Rashi, it will also be 100 ames high. It will definitely be also 100 ames long, and at 100 ames wide, at least in its widest area or in the entire area. The rooms around will be almost exactly the same. The second floor, the Kodesh HaKodashim, there's a 2 amma wall between the Kodesh and Kodesh HaKodashim rather than curtains. But the general idea is the same. The steps leading up to the Ulam, the Mizbeach is a bit different. But the general concept is the same. The Mizbeach has a 2 amma Yisoid, like we learned. But otherwise, most things are pretty much the same. The Ezras Nashim is extremely different. And that is not like here, where you have the eastern courtyard, which is what we call the bottom courtyard. You climb up 12 steps here from the Harabayis, from the Chel, from the area outside of the Beis Hamikdash is known as Chel. That's the 10 ames closest, according to the Rambam. There was even a wall all around that area. From here, you climb up 12 steps and you come into the Ezras Nashim. There's only one gate, which is the Shadow Ezras Nashim. This is the outer courtyard, but also it is the lower courtyard, not really part of the Beis Hamikdash. And we'll learn in a moment about what there was inside here. At the end of the Ezras Nashim, you have 15 half-circle steps, which they would say the Shir HaMalos on, and here it leads us to Shar Nikner, the copper gate. The gate of Nicanor, which was copper because it shone like gold, or because a miracle happened with it. There's 2 rooms on either side of the gate, opening up to Ezras Nashim, which means they're on the side of the steps. The steps are 15 steps at 7.5 ames high. There's 2 rooms where the Levim would keep their musical instruments because they would sing and play music here as well as here. Now, there's also a special room for the small Sanhedrin, the small court was in the Ezras Nashim so that they can sit. But other than that, you'd go up into this gate, into the Azara, and the Azara, there's 7 more gates, or perhaps even more than that. Other measurements are 13 gates. Whatever the case is, there's 7 main gates opening up to the Azara, also from this side, one of them being the gate from the Ezras Nashim. In the third Beis Hamikdash, the Ezras Nashim goes all around the entire area. The size is 317 ames from east to west, 312 ames from north to south. A very large area. The Azara is exactly symmetrical inside, 100 ames by 100 ames, right in the center. You have the Ezras Nashim, you have 100 ames on this side, 100 ames here. Here there's 50, because this is 50, so there's a little more than 50 over here. There's 50, 56, about 57 on this side, 50 over here, 100 over here, again the 50, and again over here 100. The Heichel is 100, 100 over here, 100 over here, 100 over here, 100 over here. So that's the way The Ezras Nashim is the large area all around, and perhaps that shows on the concept and the point of the third Beis Hamikdash, which is the third Beis Hamikdash is more about transforming the world. So we're taking something which officially is not part of the Beis Hamikdash, which we did that already by the first and second Beis Hamikdash, but there it remained outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Here it is encompassing the entire Beis Hamikdash to the extent that the Heichal itself is built in the Ezras Nashim. It opens to the inner Azara, but it's built inside the Ezras Nashim. This area gets the Kedusha of the Heichal, even though it's technically outside of it. So the Ezras Nashim gives the power of transforming the world, which is perhaps more the woman's job. The man's job is to fight with the world. The woman's job is to bring light into the dark places. And that's perhaps also hinted by the fact that Shar Niknar, which is the gate leading from Ezras Nashim, the copper, which copper shows on a low level of metal, not in the precious metals, it's the lowest level. Copper shone like gold. That's the idea of making the world shine, making even the negative and even the outer aspects of the world shine. And that is the Ezras Nashim in the third Beis Hamikdash. Now, in the third Beis Hamikdash, on the four corners of the Ezras Nashim, they will have four, what the Navi calls as courtyards. They're 40 amas wide by 30 amas, 40 amas long by 30 amas wide. What is their purpose? They will have, they're sort of like the bri areas. They have on the along their walls on the inside, they have stone slabs with holes in them for the pots, and they have fire under it, and this is where they cook the karbanis shlamim, the karbanis of the people. Other karbanis are not allowed to come out of the azara, but here they cook the karbanis. The kohanim would cook it to give it to the people to take home. In the second Beis Hamikdash, they had no such a thing. They did implement these four rooms also because they wanted to do the same thing as the third Beis Hamikdash, but they used it for different purposes. They didn't use it for cooking because there was no need to cook. A person has a carbon shlam, he brought it home and cooked it. In the third Beis Hamikdash, apparently there'll be a reason that they want to cook it in the Beis Hamikdash itself. They'll cook the carbon shlamim, and these rooms are cooking areas. Now it's different by the fact that the two upper ones are parallel with the Heichal, whereas in the Ezras Nashim, in the second Beis Hamikdash, it's all a lower courtyard. Also, the size of the rooms, many of the commentaries, as well as most of the pictures that are drawn, they make the room square, 40 by 40. The Rebbe pointed out, actually, there's like a booklet that the Rebbe commissioned before the Rebbe Nesius. Before the Rebbe became Rebbe, he commissioned someone to write a booklet about the Beis Hamikdash, which never actually came to fruition. But we do have the handwriting of the Rebbe's notes on this person's, some of the things that came already. And the Rebbe writes over there that it makes sense to say, since it doesn't say clearly the size of these rooms, it only says 40. So that's why many people assume it's 40 by 40. It makes sense to say there's 40 by 30, just like it will be in the third Beis Hamikdash, because these rooms are copied from the third Beis Hamikdash. In fact, in the third Beis Hamikdash, these rooms will not have roofs, because since they're being used to cook, you want the smoke to be able to go out. It's like a chimney, but like a big chimney, so it just doesn't have a roof at all. In the second Beis Hamikdash, they also made it without roofs, not because it was cooking rooms, but because they wanted it to be the same as the third. They used it for different purposes, but that's something which was in the Ezras Nashim in the second Beis Hamikdash, and which will be in the Ezras Nashim of the third Beis Hamikdash. There's also the porch, but that Be'ezras Hashem will learn about tomorrow. The porch in the second and in the third Beis Hamikdash.